Hello, I've come to the Goethe and Schiller archive. Its construction was commissioned and paid for by the Grand Duchess Sophie of Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach. It had opened in 1896. It's the oldest literary archive in Germany, with one of the most important collections of 18th and 19th century German literature in the world. The archive houses the entire collection of Goethe's handwritten letters and all the correspondence written by and to Nietzsche. There are also the estates of many writers and scholars and philosophers and composers too. There's an autograph collection with items by more than 3,000 writers. It seems like a suitable place to come to think about matters of interpretation. This episode began with a section from my piece Of Levinas and Self-Consciousness, which is the last movement of my third symphony, Hermeneutic Renewal. I've played other movements from the symphony in previous episodes and spoken briefly of how each movement uses a hermeneutic methodology to look for commonalities in a text and a piece of music. For instance, one of the movements, which actually I haven't looked at thus far, couples Stockhausen's Sirius and his interest in other worlds, and Lewis's realist modalism and his interest in many other worlds. But in this episode, I want to look at the last movement because it's quite different from the others. It encompasses an interpretive study of my own music, expressed in musical terms. The classical design of the interior is a reminder that the roots of interpretation, of hermeneutics, date back a long way, certainly to the medieval era and to the scholastic interpretations of sacred texts. However, its modern form can be traced to a contemporary of Goethe and Schiller, to the cultural relativism of Herder, and also to several key figures in the 19th century. Friedrich Schleiermacher, who taught at the University of Halle, about an hour from Weimar, from 1804 until 1807, at the heyday of Hegel's work in Jena, was instrumental. He was a theologian committed to reconciling the values of liberty and progress, outlined by the Enlightenment, with a liberalized account of Christian faith. He rejected the unsystematic and rather ad hoc approach towards text interpretation of the past, which dealt with handling specific problems in a piecemeal fashion, and instead, again in the Hegelian spirit, looked to develop a more systematic and cohesive methodology, an art of interpretation, which addressed the structure and function of understanding itself. Schleiermacher moved away from Halle to Berlin after the Battle of Jena, at the same time as Hegel moved south. But his work continued, eventually resulting in his Hermeneutics and Criticism of 1838, which declared that thought is not independent of language. Speech acts are not only reasoned, but also interpretive acts embedded in cognitive structure. Therefore, Hegelian dialectics must be complemented by hermeneutics. Schleiermacher argued, according to Nicholas Sowell, judgments, then, are not purely logical, but also expressive, interpretative acts embedded in the pre-existent structure of communication. Schleiermacher pursued the idea of a hermeneutic circle, whereby a comprehension of the whole requires an understanding of the component parts, and yet any inclusive comprehension of those parts requires the emphasis be placed on the whole. It reminds me of how my own symphony cannot be understood without reference to its particular use of harmony and rhythm, the characteristic use of sectionals, the importance of momentum, and to the way it references other pieces I've written. And yet each of these attributes means nothing beyond the context of the whole. Neither the whole nor the parts can be understood without the other. Schleiermacher concluded that interpretative meaning cannot exist in isolation. It always requires a context. Thereafter, the work of Nietzsche further undermined traditional concepts of interpretation. His epistemology of interpretation as metaphor argued there can be no definitive reading of a text. Interpretation is employed merely to support a subject's will to power, their purpose in being alive. Hans-Georg Gadamer, a leading 20th century figure in the Hermeneutics tradition, commented on Nietzsche's arguments in his essay The Universality of the Hermeneutical Problem, originally published in 1966. Alienation in aesthetic judgment always takes place when we have withdrawn ourselves and are no longer open to the immediate claim of that which grasps us. Nietzsche traces the value blindness of historical objectivism back to the conflict between the alienated historical world and the life powers of the present. The greatest exponent of the new tradition of interpretation at the beginning of the 20th century was Wilhelm Dilthey at the University of Berlin, who championed the hermeneutics of art in particular. He sought to establish the foundations of an empirical methodology for the social sciences, and argued that scientific positivism must be complemented with a theory of how the world is perceived through symbolically mediated practices. Dilthey argued, according to Robertson, that the study of history, and by extension of all human affairs, consists in a circulation of experience, understanding and generalization. Thus, after Nietzschean skepticism, a hermeneutic theory based on Laban's philosophy restored the possibility of knowledge. Thereafter, at the beginning of the 20th century, hermeneutics was subject to the ontological turn of the phenomenologists, and especially of Heidegger's Being in Time, which fundamentally transformed the discipline. No longer was methodology restricted to matters of linguistic communication. Hermeneutics was to be identified with ontology, in that it pertained to the most fundamental questions of man's being in the world. Gadamer wrote in his essay Hermeneutics and the Ontological Difference, in which he looks back to his time as a student under Heidegger, in Dilthey, hermeneutics is classified under psychology. It was only with the change that Heidegger gave it in his receiving of Husserlian phenomenology, which at the same time meant his reception of Dilthey's writings through phenomenology, that hermeneutics took on a fundamentally philosophical meaning. Thus it was that hermeneutics shifted from epistemics to metaphysics of practice, whereby understanding is treated as an event entity in a linguistic domain. The text is handled as subservient to how interaction with the text changes self-understanding and the being engaged with it. Being itself becomes hermeneutical in the sense that the subject is always situated midway between the event entity that understands and the entity that is to be understood. Gadamer wrote, basically, no human being knows what the concept Dasein means. And yet we all have a pre-understanding when we hear the word, and we understand that here the being that belongs to all beings has now been raised to the level of a concept. And so now it is different from all beings. This is what the ontological difference means, first and above all. The gardens circling the building are very pleasant. From the terrace there's an impressive view across Weimar. It just needs a string quartet to be playing in the background. Indeed, these same principles apply to music. Music is situated in the cultural setting of pre-understandings, and any interpretations made, any event entities of new understanding, whether of the formal elements of composition or of performance or listening practices, are both derived and determined by social and artistic contexts, and also able to elevate the same. In looking at my own music, the formalist in me wants to describe the technical elements of the music, the contrasting rhythms and orchestrations, the attention to an idiomatic use of instruments, but not the way in which the music breathes. Gadamer wrote, the consciousness of art, the aesthetic consciousness, is always secondary to the immediate truth claim that proceeds from the work of art itself. To this extent, when we judge a work of art on the basis of its aesthetic quality, something that is really much more intimately familiar to us is alienated. A hermeneutical phenomenological methodology applied to my symphony would not limit itself to formalist details regarding musical notes and their patterning of structure, and neither would it limit itself to subjective aesthetics. It would need to explain the context in which music is both constructed and heard, and the nature of the interpretative understandings it revealed both in itself and in those contexts. Gadamer wrote in his essay Aesthetics and Hermeneutics, originally published in 1964, hermeneutics bridges the difference between minds and reveals the foreignness of the other mind. The work of Gadamer addressing these issues was not only influenced by Heidegger. He was also involved in the so-called linguistic turn of the mid-20th century, which emphasised how intentional thought is always bound up with language and its heritage of past meanings. What appears to the subject as a private domain of thought is already deeply influenced by everything that has preceded that thought. Gadamer wrote, The entire experience of the world is linguistically mediated, and the broadest concept of tradition is thus defined, one that includes what is not itself linguistically, but is capable of linguistic interpretation.
Gadamer argued that interpretation cannot be seen to exist apart from language. Language defines concepts used to perceive the world and the interpretation therein. Accordingly, interpretation pertains not only to the academic study of literature or the study of music, but to all personal and social experiences which affect that interpretation.
Consequently, Gadamer's work can also be seen to make reference to epistemology. His writings embrace both Kantian notions of transcendental cognition and Hegelian notions of time-driven dialectics to define two types of epistemic capacities. Firstly, there's receptivity, the qualitative notions of time and space. And then there's spontaneity, the qualitative notions of understanding. Gadamer argued that interpretation and all knowledge is subject to modification, and accordingly there is never any end state of understanding. There is no meaning to the notion of absolute truth, or infallibility, or other fundamentalist states which are used to underpin dogma or ideology. Gadamer wrote, "The creator of a work of art may have in mind the public of his own time, but the real being of his work is what it is able to say, and thus being reaches fundamentally beyond any historical confinement. In this sense, the work of art occupies a timeless present."
It's true that I had not only the Weimar Halle in mind when I wrote my Third Symphony, but also the promenaders at the Royal Albert Hall. Yet the meaning of the music reaches beyond this fancy. The work remains with me whenever I listen to Bach's First Brandenburg or Schoenberg's Variations, sometimes coming forward and causing a chuckle, but mostly in the far distance.
Gadamer wrote in Aesthetics and Hermeneutics, "Goethe's statement, 'everything is a symbol,' is a most comprehensive formulation of the hermeneutical idea. It means that everything points to some other thing. This everything is not an assertion about each being, indicating what it is, but an assertion as how it is to encounter man's understanding. There is nothing that cannot mean something to it." But the statement implies something else as well. The impossibility of surveying all relations is just as much present in Goethe's concept of the symbolic as is the vicarious function of the particular for the representation of the whole. For only because the universal relatedness of being is concealed from human eyes does it need to be discovered. As universal as a hermeneutical idea is that corresponds to Goethe's words, in an eminent sense it's fulfilled only by the experience of art. For the distinctive mark of the language of art is that the individual artwork gathers into itself and expresses a symbolic character that, hermeneutically regarded, belongs to all things.
By the 1970s, at the same time that the Kripkean revolution on one side of the Atlantic was challenging the dominance of mainstream empiricism, on the Weimar side of the pond, the new wave of post-structuralism was claiming that orthodox approaches to social science had also failed to create theory and practical predictions of any substantive meaning.
In psychology, the claims that learning theory would be able to provide universal explanatory models were deemed to have failed after previously being viewed as an exemplary form of rigorous behavioural science. Into the breach came the rise of relativism, historicity, existentialism, and the conviction that interpretations of culture owe more to the contextual circumstances of those making the interpretations than to the objective infrastructure of cognition. The notion of mind and nature as analogous returned to the foreground, and hermeneutics entered the mainstream.
One of the foremost figures among the new generation of Frankfurters to take hermeneutics forward was Jurgen Habermas. I'll look at his work in a later episode, but for now it's worthwhile pointing out he's one of the many who've used the notion of interpretation to aid a political agenda, particularly pertaining to matters of social justice. But he also sought to understand the act of interpretation itself.
Habermas said, "If we hear somebody speak, there is a double perspective, the observable event and the understanding of meaning. We can describe events without understanding meaning. The meaning comes from communication action, which requires interpretation. Rather than predictive science, where what is true or false is stated, An illocutionary speech act is presented in a manner whereby the audience can understand what is said. Hermeneutics watches language at work as used by participants to reach common understanding or shared view. Hermeneutics is embedded in relationships that are complex, where statements are not only about topic at hand, but those social relationships. Habermas refuted the very possibility of objective justification. He rejected the paradigm of a solitary subject that confronts objects and, by perceiving and representing them mentally, turns itself into an object. Instead, cognition is mediated by language and embodied in the web of everyday life and communication. Therefore, acting and speaking are privileged above the epistemics of knowing. The focus on the cognitive function of consciousness, the representational function of language, is refuted. The notions of rationalism, incontrovertible truth, and justified belief are refuted. Habermas said hermeneutics deals simultaneously with the threefold relationship evolved in an utterance, which serves as A. an expression of the speaker's intention, B. an expression of the establishment of an interpersonal relationship between speaker and hearer, and C. an expression about something in the world.
Applied to the last movement of my symphony, this would involve my original intent as composer, that which is mostly lost even to me, the relationship between what I can recover of that original intent and my interpretation of the music now, and what this relationship means to the world, or to my perception of the world. This is a very different approach to merely trying to recreate meaning, given I've changed many of my ideas in the past couple of years, and any accurate recapturing of any original intent will be impossible anyway.
Hermeneutics recognizes that the purpose of interpretation is not merely the reconstruction of another agent's perspective, but a description of the situatedness of the human existence underpinning that perspective, as well as the interpreter's perspective. The inquiry is not limited to the text of the piece of music or any kind of semiotics alone, but the hermeneutic subject itself, which is in a perpetual state of dialogue with itself, as well as with matters pertaining to the object of study, and is continually having to reconfigure understandings. Holub wrote that Habermas advocates that tradition must continuously be subjected to critique, and that a hermeneutic theory that does not postulate some means of escaping the hold of our flawed heritage is ultimately a conservation enterprise. Hermeneutics analysis is able to place an emphasis on understanding the process of consensus making that governs society's view of a canon of quality artwork or literature or music, which is continually shifting.
Most particularly, rather than placing the interpreter on a pedestal, judging the past based on the would-be preeminence of objectivity, it creates a level playing field between original intent and interpretation.
Habermas said, interpreters relinquish the superiority that observers have by virtue of the privileged position, in that they themselves are drawn, at least potentially, into negotiations about the meaning and validity of utterances. By taking part in communicative action, they accept in principle the same status as those whose utterances they are trying to understand.
This levelling of the field has other implications that are important to Habermas's agenda, such as those pertaining to abuses of authority, not just in critical interpretation, but in all aspects of society. He abhorred the justification made by authority of the status quo by way of creating the illusion that the inequities and prejudices of that status quo are somehow judicious and suitable.
Habermas rejected the notion, according to Robert Holub, that authority exists because it's been accepted rather than imposed. Habermas defends the Enlightenment precisely because it posited a reflective ability to challenge authority, to question prejudices, and to criticise the canonical works of the past.
If one of the purposes of this inquiry has been to look at my own music through the Enlightenment figures of classical Weimar, and the notion of analogous relationships between mind and nature posited by the Weimar identity thesis, then I need to apply the values of hermeneutic interpretation and continual reinterpretation to my own canonical past. This is what I've tried to do in my third symphony. However, rather than express an interpretation of my own music and its context linguistically, I've sought to do it musically. So here's another section from the piece. Thanks for listening.